The morning began like any other, and that was perhaps the cruelest deception of all. Across the coastal cities of Earth, dawn broke in the pale gold of an ordinary summer. Birds returning to their branches, fairies slicing through mist, radio towers humming with the familiar noise of a world that believed itself safe. Yet somewhere far above the atmosphere, in the black silence where physics grew shy, something ancient had begun to stir. A tremor without sound, a pressure without weight. A whisper spoken in a language older than the stars. It had started weeks earlier, though most had chosen not to see it. Gravitational storms drifted through the oceans without warning, pulling tides where no tides should exist. Crimson auroras bled across skies that had never known such color, curling like the veins of a wounded god. Astronomers argued through sleepless nights over impossible alignments, planets appearing where none had been mapped, constellations shifting a hair to the left as if the universe itself were adjusting its posture. The scientists spoke of anomalies, the prophets spoke of endings. Both were correct and both were far too small. The Avengers had felt it first, though even they had not fully understood. Ever since the collapse of the sacred timeline and the fracturing of realities that had begun with Kang and would end with something far worse, the world had been living on borrowed silence. Dr. Strange no longer slept without waking in cold sweat. Reed Richards had filled entire notebooks with equations that refused to balance. Shuri had detected pulses beneath the Wakandan mountains, faint and rhythmic, as though the earth itself were breathing in preparation for a scream. And yet, even with all their wisdom, none of them had guessed the shape the reckoning would take. The signal appeared first as a shadow on the deep space sensors of a lonely observatory in Chile. A single technician, half asleep with coffee cooling beside her, saw a mass she could not measure. It did not belong to any known trajectory. It did not obey the geometry of natural bodies. It simply was, enormous and patient, sitting on the edge of the solar system like a decision that had already been made. She reached for her phone. She did not finish dialing. The fleet emerged from a dimensional fracture the size of a continent, and reality shivered at the intrusion. Ships of black metal, curved and cathedral tall, slid into the light of the sun as though they had always been meant to arrive. Their hulls bore the sigil of a dead world, a coiled emblem that had once ruled a civilization ancient beyond mortal comprehension. Krypton had perished long ago in another universe, another timeline, another grief. But grief, when disciplined by intelligence, does not simply die. It waits. It plans. It arms itself. General Zod stood upon the command deck of his flagship, hands folded behind his back, watching the blue and green world turning below. He was not smiling. He was not raging. He was simply observing, the way a sculptor observes uncarved stone. His armor bore the scars of 1,000 engagements across 1,000 dying stars, and his face carried the quiet weight of a soldier who had long ago accepted that mercy was a luxury only the doomed could afford. His scanners had already told him everything he needed to know. This Earth was not the Earth of his memory. This Earth held vibranium veins that pulsed with cosmic music, celestial bones buried in the ocean floors, quantum gateways humming beneath abandoned laboratories, and the residual echoes of Kang's forgotten machinery scattered like breadcrumbs across a dozen continents. It was, in every measurable sense, the birthplace of an empire waiting to be claimed. He gave the order without ceremony. The gravity cannons opened first, invisible weapons that reached across the void and pressed down upon Earth's satellites with the calm certainty of a hand closing a book. Communication networks blinked and died. Orbital defenses tumbled from their perches, spiraling into the atmosphere as burning stars. In Tokyo, in Lagos, in Buenos Aires, in every city that had grown used to the comfort of connection, screens flickered and went dark. And then the sky itself began to change, because the ships had come lower, and their shadows were wider than the horizon. Zod's voice carried across every frequency that remained, calm, unhurried, almost gentle. He spoke of history. He spoke of the countless civilizations that had risen only to vanish because they had refused to bow before an inevitable order. He offered humanity a choice, not as a threat, but as a courtesy extended by a strategist who understood that even conquest required consent from the conquered. Serve, he said, and inherit a future beyond your imagination. Resist, and become the quiet lesson taught to those who come after. Across the world, heroes stirred. In Wakanda, alarms rang through corridors that had never expected to hear them. In New York, Sam Wilson stood upon a rooftop and watched the sun disappear behind a wall of impossible metal. In the Sanctum Sanctorum, Dr. Strange whispered a name he did not yet understand. And somewhere in the shadowed halls of Latveria, a man in a green cloak watched the invasion unfold on 100 silent screens. And he allowed himself at last the smallest curve of a smile. Dr. Doom had been waiting. The days that followed the arrival were unlike any Earth had ever endured. There was no immediate declaration of war, no thunderous opening salvo across the great cities. Instead, there was a silence, deep and deliberate. The silence of a predator that has already decided the outcome and is merely choosing the hour. The Kryptonian ships hung motionless above the continents, their shadows moving with the rotation of the world, indifferent to the panic below. Governments issued statements no one listened to. Refugees moved inland from coastlines that had gone dark, and in the quiet spaces between fear and fury, the heroes gathered. Sam Wilson stood at the head of a long steel table in a bunker beneath the Rocky Mountains, surrounded by faces that had once been familiar and were now merely tired. Spider-Man perched on the back of a chair, mask in his lap, eyes red from a night without sleep. Dr. Strange leaned against a pillar, arms crossed, his cloak unusually still. Shuri had brought 3 tablets and was already dismissing 2 of them as inadequate. Reed Richards was drawing on the wall with a marker, ignoring the protests of a soldier who had clearly given up on decorum. There were new faces, too, younger heroes who had inherited the mantle from those no longer present. And they watched Sam with the quiet reverence of children studying a father who has been asked to become a god. Sam did not want to be a symbol. He wanted, more than anything, to be a soldier again, a man with a clear mission and a clear enemy. But the wings on his back had grown heavier since he had accepted the shield, and now, standing before the last coordinated defense of a fractured planet, he understood that heaviness was simply the price of being trusted. He spoke plainly. Reconnaissance first, understanding before violence. They did not yet know what the Kryptonians were, only what they could do, and the difference between those 2 things had killed more armies than any weapon. The first missions revealed the shape of the nightmare. A team led by a young speedster attempted to intercept a Kryptonian scouting patrol over the Pacific and returned with only 3 survivors, all of them silent. All of them changed. Conventional bullets flattened against Kryptonian armor as though the armor were amused. Energy weapons produced sparks and nothing more. A Wakandan strike squad managed to bring down a single soldier by collapsing a bridge beneath him. And even then, he rose from the wreckage with dust in his hair and irritation in his eyes. And he walked away as though the ambush had been a mild inconvenience on his morning commute. Reed Richards watched the recordings 100 times, and each viewing deepened his fascination and his dread. The Kryptonians were not merely strong, they were engineered. Their cells drank the yellow sun like scripture, converting radiation into raw ability with an efficiency that mocked every biological law he had ever written. Their armor was grown, not forged, layered from a metal that resonated with their own bioelectric signatures. And their tactics, Reed noted with a scientist's cold admiration, were older than any known human doctrine, precise, patient, and utterly devoid of ego. These were not warriors seeking glory. These were craftsmen practicing an art. Dr. Strange, meanwhile, walked through his own inner corridors, searching for a truth that kept slipping away from him. He had tested his magic against a captured Kryptonian in a shielded chamber deep beneath Kamar Taj, and the results had unsettled him. His spells could wound them. Flames of the Faltine could burn Kryptonian skin. Bindings of Sidorak could hold them, at least briefly. But the deeper mystical arts, the ones that unraveled reality itself, slid across their forms like water across polished glass. Something in the Kryptonian soul, or whatever substitute had grown in its place, resisted the very idea of transformation. They were, in a sense that Strange could not fully articulate, real in a way that magic did not quite believe. And then there was the fracture. The tier in space through which the fleet had arrived had not closed. It hung above the outer solar system, faint but persistent, its edges shimmering with a light that did not belong to any spectrum. Strange had studied it through mirrors and mandalas and long nights of meditation, and each time he emerged with the same suspicion, growing stronger, refusing to leave him. The fracture was not natural. It had not been opened by chance or by the general instability of the multiverse. It had been made, cut deliberately by a hand that had known exactly where to cut and exactly when. Above them all, Zod studied humanity with the patience of a historian. He walked the observation deck of his flagship each evening, watching the lights of Earth's cities glow and flicker like fires around which the last of the old tribes gathered. He admired what he saw. Their resilience impressed him. Their ingenuity, though primitive, carried echoes of Krypton in its youth before the great collapse had taught his people the price of hesitation. But he despised their fractures. Nation against nation, hero against hero, ideology against ideology. A world so divided, he mused, was not truly a world at all. It was a collection of arguments waiting to be silenced. He gathered his officers and spoke of the plan. World engines would descend within the month, artificial suns would be seated above the poles, and the genetic codex would be prepared for the reintroduction of Kryptonian bloodlines to a new home. The occupation would be complete before the next winter, and by the spring after that, Earth would be a garden again, tended by the strong. His officers bowed. They did not question. Loyalty in the Kryptonian tradition was not obedience. It was survival remembered. Yet Zod was not a fool, and something in the fabric of this world troubled him. His scanners had flagged Earth with a designation his ancestors had reserved for anomalies, a phrase carved into the oldest war doctrines of his people, the world that should not exist. He did not yet know what it meant, but he intended, with the quiet certainty of a man who had never lost, to find out. The decision to strike came not from strategy but from grief. Too many patrols had failed to return. Too many silent cities had woken to Kryptonian banners planted in their squares. Too many children had asked their parents when the sun would come back, and their parents had learned to lie with an ease that broke them. Sam Wilson stood before the world's remaining defenders and told them the truth, which was that they could not win, and then he told them the deeper truth, which was that they had to fight anyway. The offensive began at dawn, coordinated across 4 continents. In New York, Spider-Man led a defense of the harbor, weaving between falling debris with a grace that had grown sharper since the invasion began. In Wakanda, Shuri unleashed weapons her brother had never lived to see, resonance cannons tuned to frequencies that made Kryptonian armor sing and crack. In Latveria, a strange thing happened, for the country had gone silent since the arrival, and now its defenses activated in perfect synchronization with the Avengers, though no order had been given and no alliance had been declared. Reed Richards saw the pattern and said nothing because he had known, in the private caverns of his mind, that doom would move eventually, and he had already decided to accept the help without accepting the man. Above the atmosphere, the orbital battle unfolded like a symphony written in fire. Human fighters, cobbled together from every nation that still possessed a functional air force, dove between Kryptonian dreadnoughts with a courage that had no scientific explanation. Most did not survive. Those who did carried stories the world would tell for generations, of pilots who rammed their crippled craft into gravity cannons, of engineers who rewired failing engines with their bare hands as the vacuum reached for them, of captains who broadcast their final words in every language they knew so that someone, somewhere would remember. On the ground, the Avengers fought with a strategy Zod had not anticipated. They did not try to match the Kryptonians in strength. They used the world itself. Dr. Strange collapsed a skyscraper onto a Kryptonian squad and then folded the rubble into a pocket dimension before the soldiers could climb free. Spider-Man led a battalion of enemies into the flooded tunnels beneath the East River, and then triggered a chain of demolitions that sent the entire river down upon them. Shuri activated ancient Wakandan resonance chambers hidden beneath the Great Mound, and for the first time in centuries, the Earth itself sang a note that could shake Kryptonian bones. There were victory. A Kryptonian sub-commander was captured alive after Dr. Strange bound him in the flames of a dying star. A world engine descending toward the Sahara was destroyed in mid-fall by a combined strike of Wakandan and Latverian technology. A city thought lost was liberated by a coalition of ordinary soldiers led by a captain who had never worn a costume in her life. And in each of these moments, the world remembered, briefly, what hope tasted like, but the cost was unbearable. Entire teams of heroes fell in a single afternoon. A generation of young champions, barely trained, barely known, gave their lives to buy ours. Sam watched the casualty reports arrive in numb silence, and each name became a stone in a wall he was building inside himself, a wall he suspected would one day collapse and bury him. Spider-Man returned from the tunnels covered in mud and something darker, and when he removed his mask, his face was not the face of a boy any longer. He had seen a mother die trying to shield her child from falling steel. He had seen the child die anyway. He would carry both of them for the rest of his life. Zod entered the battle personally on the third day. He did not arrive with fanfare. He simply descended from the sky above a battlefield where the Avengers had been holding a fragile line, and he began to fight. He did not kill. That was the terror of him. He broke bones without breaking lives. He shattered armor without shattering souls. He wanted witnesses, not corpses, because a corpse could not kneel and a corpse could not tell the story. One by one, Earth's strongest defenders fell before him, and one by one, he left them alive in the dust so that when they woke they would understand. Reed Richards, meanwhile, had found something deep in the archives of the captured Kryptonian subcommander's ship. Buried beneath layers of encryption that had taken him and Shuri 3 sleepless days to unravel, there was a record. A single reference, mentioned only in passing, in a war doctrine so old that even the Kryptonian AI had flagged it as legend. It spoke of an entity, a presence, something that had shaped realities long before Kang had ever dreamed of his empire, long before the Celestials had walked the cosmic dark. The record called it the Architect, and it noted, with a chill that transcended language, that the Architect's symbols had appeared in the ruins of every civilization Krypton had ever encountered, always in the same place, always after the fall. Reed showed the record to Sam. Sam showed it to Strange. Strange went very still, and then he asked to see the symbol. When Reed drew it on the wall, Strange did not speak for a long time. Finally, he said only that he had seen it before, on the walls of the sanctum, on the pages of the Book of Vishanti, and most recently embroidered on the inner lining of a green cloak worn by a man who called himself a king. Zod, above the burning cities, felt something too. His visor flickered with data he could not immediately parse. His ancestors, or the fragments of them preserved in the genetic codex, seemed to whisper in a language he had almost forgotten. And beneath the earth of a small European country, in a vault sealed for 1,000 years, a door began to open, and a man in green stepped through it, alone and unafraid. The vault beneath Latveria had been built before the country had a name, long before Doom's grandfather had drawn his first breath, before the borders had been etched into the stone of the Balkans, before the very idea of Latveria had crystallized in the ambition of a wandering people. The vault had waited. It had been carved by hands that no longer existed, sealed by minds that had passed beyond the reach of memory. And now, as the sky above burned with the light of Kryptonian engines and Avenger jets locked in a war that had already outlived its cause, Victor Von Doom descended into the vault alone, and he did not tremble. He carried no weapon. He wore no armor beyond the green that had become his skin. He walked with the measured pace of a scholar entering a library he had visited 1,000 times in dreams. The corridors around him were not merely passages. They were arguments, carved into the walls in a script older than Sanskrit, older than the first star maps, older than the concept of language itself. Doom read them as easily as another man might read a menu. He had spent decades learning to read them. It had been, he sometimes reflected, the true purpose of his exile, the true meaning of every humiliation he had endured. Every time the world had called him a monster, he had smiled inwardly, because the world did not yet understand what monster meant. At the heart of the vault, in a chamber lit by no visible source, he found what he had come for. It was not a weapon. It was not a treasure. It was a question, suspended in the air, humming with a frequency that made his teeth ache and his mind expand. The reality-forging engine buried before recorded history, older than the Celestials, older than the Infinity Stones, older than the first breath of the first god. A machine that did not merely alter reality but wrote it, the way a scribe might write a letter, choosing which words to include and which to leave in the drafts. Doom did not touch it. He had learned, long ago, that the most powerful things were the ones you did not touch until you understood them completely. Instead, he sat before it, cross-legged in the dust, and he began to speak. He spoke to the Avengers, though they were hundreds of miles away. He spoke to Zod, though the General did not yet know he was listening. He spoke through channels that were not radio, not telepathy, not magic, but something older and stranger, a form of communication that predated the separation of these categories. His voice arrived in the minds of every faction leader on Earth at the same instant, and it carried an authority that could not be dismissed. He told them the truth. Or rather, he told them the portion of the truth he had chosen to share, which was still more than any of them had suspected. He had spent years preparing for a multiversal extinction event. He had known it was coming since the collapse of the sacred timeline, since the first tremor of Kang's fall, since the whispers had begun in the deepest sanctums of his research. He did not support the Avengers. He did not oppose them. He did not support Zod, and he did not oppose him. Both factions, he explained with the patience of a teacher addressing slow students, were moving toward an ancient cosmic trap without realizing it, and if they did not stop, the trap would close, and reality itself would be pruned. He spoke of the engine. He described its age in terms that made Reed Richards, listening in his laboratory, sit down heavily and place both hands upon the desk to steady himself. Doom explained that whoever controlled the engine could overwrite existence, could edit the multiverse the way a novelist edits a manuscript, deleting entire chapters, inserting new characters, revising the ending. Zod, hearing this from the observation deck of his flagship, felt a stillness settle over him that he had not felt since the death of his home world. He understood immediately what he had to do. Krypton would possess the engine, not for conquest, for resurrection. The heroes gathered in emergency council. Sam Wilson listened to Reed in strange debate whether Doom could be trusted, and he found himself, for the first time in his career, unable to reach a clear conclusion. Doom had lied before. Doom had schemed before. Doom had, on more than one occasion, tried to kill people Sam had loved, and yet, in the voice that had reached them through impossible channels, there had been something Sam had never heard from Doom before: fear. Not the fear of a man afraid to die, but the fear of a mind that had glimpsed something too vast to fight alone. Reed Richards did not sleep that night. He walked the halls of his laboratory with the manic energy of a man whose lifelong rivalry had suddenly, terribly, become the least important thing in his life. He had spent decades defining himself against Doom. He had built a career, a marriage, a family, an identity upon the certainty that Doom was wrong and he was right. And now Doom was telling him that both of them had been standing on the edge of the same abyss, arguing about the color of the railing while the earth crumbled beneath them. Reed did not know how to grieve for a rivalry, but he suspected with a sadness that surprised him that he would have to learn. Dr. Strange, alone in the sanctum, opened the oldest book he owned. He turned to a page he had never before dared to read, and he read it now, and when he closed the book his hands were shaking. The symbol Reed had drawn on the wall, the architect, Doom's cloak, they were all the same, and the book in its final line warned that when the symbols began to converge, it was already too late to prevent the awakening. The prison was not merely a prison, it was a countdown, and someone, somewhere, had been counting down for a very long time. Beneath Latveria, in the chamber Doom had entered alone, the engine began at last to stir. Its light was not light. Its sound was not sound, and Doom, sitting before it, unarmed and unafraid, permitted himself a single moment of doubt. The awakening began quietly, the way all true catastrophes do. There was no explosion at first, no visible sign that anything had changed. Only a subtle wrongness, the kind of sensation a person feels when they walk into a familiar room and cannot immediately identify what has been moved. Across the world, people paused in the middle of ordinary actions and looked up, as though summoned. Birds fell silent in mid-song. Clocks ticked out of rhythm with themselves. And in every city, from the ruined boulevards of New York to the shattered spires of Wakanda, gravity forgot its own name for the space of a single breath, and then remembered, and then forgot again. Sam Wilson was in the air when it happened. He had been leading a formation of drones over the Atlantic, coordinating a supply run to a besieged coastal city, when the sky simply stopped agreeing with itself. His wings, which had carried him through a decade of impossible battles, suddenly did not know which direction was up. He tumbled through a pocket of air that behaved like water, then through a pocket of water that behaved like fire, and when he finally stabilized, he was hovering above a version of the ocean he did not recognize. The waves moved in patterns he had never seen. The horizon curved wrong. And on the distant shore, a city he had never visited was burning, and its skyline belonged to no country he had ever known. The reality engine had woken. Doom had warned them. Strange had prepared them. But no warning could have described the actual sensation of a universe beginning to edit itself in real time. Cities partially phased into alternate timelines, so that a family sitting down to dinner in one timeline found themselves sharing the table with strangers from another, and neither could speak the other's language, and both were too terrified to try. Heroes disappeared mid-stride, stepping from one street to another and never arriving, absorbed into fractured dimensions where their skills meant nothing and their names had never been spoken. A young speedster ran through a doorway in Chicago and emerged in a version of Chicago that had been ruled by dinosaurs for 10 million years. And she stood there, breathing carefully, and understood that she would never see her mother again. Zod fought through the chaos with the discipline of a soldier who had trained for exactly this kind of madness. Though even he had not fully imagined its shape, his fleet suffered devastating losses. Entire dreadnoughts vanished into fissures that opened without warning. A quarter of his forces were consumed in the first hour, and the numbers only worsened as the day progressed. But he did not falter. He drove his remaining ships toward the central chamber of the engine with a single-mindedness that his officers found both terrifying and holy. He would not lose this. He could not. Krypton had died once already. He would not permit it to die again. Doom, in the vault, tried everything he knew, and everything he knew was not enough. He wove containment fields from mathematics that had never been written down. He spoke words of binding in languages that predated speech. He offered the engine bargains it did not acknowledge. It was, he realized with a cold clarity, not a mind that could be reasoned with. It was a process, and processes, once begun, did not negotiate. Zod's forces breached the vault on the 7th hour. The battle was brief and terrible. Doom fought as he had never fought before, and for a moment, watching him hurl a Kryptonian officer across the chamber with a gesture that seemed to unmake the officer entirely, Reed Richards understood that his rival had always been holding back, in every previous encounter, for reasons Reed could not begin to guess. But there were too many Kryptonians, and Doom was one man, and when Zod himself entered the chamber, Doom finally stepped back, and he did not step forward again. Zod stood before the engine's central console and placed his hand upon it. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the console recognized him. Not as a stranger, not as a conqueror, but as something the engine had been waiting for. The Kryptonian genetic signature, ancient beyond any of them had realized, unlocked mechanisms that had been sealed since before the first star had cooled. Zod's face, in that moment, was not the face of a general. It was the face of a man who had just been told that everything he had ever believed was true, and also that everything he had ever believed was a lie. And the two truths could not be reconciled. The Avengers scattered, not by choice, but by the physics of a reality that no longer respected their intentions. Spider-Man found himself alone in a version of Queens where his aunt had never existed, and where he had never been bitten by anything at all. He stood on a street corner in a body that felt vaguely wrong, and he cried briefly, and then he began the long walk back toward a version of himself that would recognize him. Doctor Strange fell through the layers of the sanctum until he emerged in a library that stretched forever, and every book in it was a version of the same book, and the book was about him, and each version ended differently, and none of the endings were kind. Sam Wilson, having stabilized his flight, made his way back to what remained of the command bunker. He found it half-phased, one wall standing in his timeline and the other standing somewhere else. And inside the fragment that remained, he found a handful of survivors who looked at him with eyes that had already given up. He did not know what to tell them. For the first time in his life, standing in the wreckage of everything he had tried to build, he felt his faith falter, not disappear, not shatter, simply lean quietly against a wall it could no longer trust. Zod in the chamber stood before the engine and saw. He saw universes that had lived and died in the space of a thought. He saw versions of himself who had chosen differently and had suffered the same. He saw a symbol he had known his entire life, carved into the walls of Krypton's oldest temples, and now he saw it here, in a vault older than his species. And he understood, with a horror that no soldier had ever prepared him for, that he might not have been the invader at all. He might have been summoned. Recovery did not arrive with fanfare. It came the way rain comes to a scorched field, hesitantly, unevenly, with long pauses between drops. In the days after the engine's awakening, survivors from every faction began the slow work of finding one another again. Sam Wilson walked for 3 days through a landscape that shifted around him, refusing to give up on the coordinates of the last safe haven he knew. When he arrived, he found others already waiting, drawn by the same stubborn refusal to accept that the story had ended. The gathering that formed in the ruins of what had once been a mountain research facility was unlike any alliance Earth had ever known. Doom was there, seated at one end of a long makeshift table, his mask reflecting the firelight with a stillness that would have unnerved anyone who did not know him. Sam sat at the other end, wings folded behind him, the shield resting on his knees. Between them, in every chair that could be found and on every crate that could be dragged into service, sat the strangest coalition in the history of the planet. Avengers still bearing the wounds of the first invasion. Kryptonian officers who had defected the moment they had seen the engine's true purpose, their loyalty transferring from Zod to the survival of existence itself. Wakandan generals. Atlantean ambassadors, their eyes still adjusting to the surface air. Mystic orders whose members had not left their monasteries in centuries. Cosmic survivors from realities that had already ended. Refugees who had arrived on Earth by accident and now had nowhere else to go. The debates were long and painful. There were factions within the alliance that could barely stand to share air with one another. Doom and Reed sat across the table for 6 hours before either of them spoke, and when Red finally did speak, he did not address Doom directly. He addressed the problem. Doom nodded once, and something almost imperceptible passed between them. An acknowledgement that their rivalry, however deep, was no longer the axis around which the universe turned. It was a small thing. But small things in that room had begun to carry the weight of continents. Sam took on the role no one else could carry. He was not the strongest in the room. He was not the most brilliant. He was not the most powerful. But he was, in a way that surprised even himself, the most trusted. Kryptonian defectors listened to him because he did not condescend to them. Mystic orders listened to him because he did not pretend to understand what they did. Ordinary humans listened to him because he had once been ordinary himself and had not forgotten it. He spoke plainly. He asked questions. He accepted answers he did not like. And slowly, without ever declaring himself as such, he became the center around which the alliance began to hold. Zod, meanwhile, walked alone through what remained of his flagship. His fleet was in ruins. His officers were dead or defected. The visions he had glimpsed in the engine's chamber had not left him, and each night, as he attempted to sleep, he saw again the symbol carved into the walls of Krypton's oldest temples, and he understood a little more of what it meant. He had believed for his entire life that Krypton had died because it had been weak. He was beginning to suspect that Krypton had died because it had been remembered. Someone or something had been pruning his people long before the planet had cracked. And the invasion he had led, the empire he had planned, had been a movement in a dance choreographed by hands he had never seen. He requested audience with the Alliance. He did not demand, he requested. And when he arrived, unarmed, alone, and without ceremony, Sam Wilson stood to greet him, and the two men looked at one another across a distance that was not measured in feet. Zod spoke first. He did not apologize. Apologies in the Kryptonian tradition were the currency of the defeated, and he was not yet defeated, only redirected, but he offered what he could: intelligence. Access to Kryptonian archives that predated the fall of his world, and, most importantly, his own hands, which had been trained for war since before Sam had been born, and which were now available for a war Sam had not yet named. The training began. In the caverns beneath the Alliance's headquarters, in the mystic halls of Kamor-Taj, in the reforged laboratories of Wakanda and Latveria, and the remnants of Reed's own facilities, the survivors of Earth's first great multiversal war began to prepare for a second. They learned techniques that had been forgotten before the pyramids had been built. Doom shared research he had never intended to share, and he did so without ceremony, as though he were merely handing over a tool. Reed offered theories he had been afraid to publish, and Doom improved them without comment. Kryptonian officers taught human soldiers combat forms that had been developed to fight gods. Mystic masters taught Kryptonian defectors meditations that opened doors within themselves they had not known existed. Spider-Man, who had returned from his fractured queens with a quiet that had not left him, began to teach the younger heroes. He did not teach them how to fight. He taught them how to keep fighting. There was a difference, he explained one evening to a room full of trainees, and the difference was the thing that had kept him alive when everything else had failed. Hope was not a feeling. Hope was a decision. You made it in the morning, and you made it again in the afternoon, and you made it once more before you slept, and if you made it enough times, it eventually became a habit, and habits were harder to kill than feelings. Sam listened from the doorway, and he did not interrupt. When Spider-Man was finished, Sam walked away without being seen, and he made his own decision, for the 1,000th time that week, to keep going. The Alliance was fragile. The enemy was vast. The odds were, by any rational measure, impossible. But the armies were marching now from every direction toward the Earth's ancient core, where the engine still hummed, and where the final chapter of a story older than the multiverse was preparing at last to be written. The march to the core lasted 7 days, and each day was a lifetime. The Alliance moved in overlapping columns across a landscape that no longer obeyed any map, guided by Dr. Strange's mystic navigation and by the ancient Kryptonian star, charts that Zod had unlocked from vaults his own people had forgotten they possessed. The world around them shifted constantly. Forests became deserts, became oceans, became forests again, sometimes within the space of an hour. Time behaved with a cruelty that was almost personal. Some soldiers aged years in a single afternoon. Others were briefly returned to childhood and had to be carried until the effect wore off. Spider-Man, walking beside Sam through a valley that kept changing its own geography, remarked quietly that he had stopped trying to understand it and had begun instead to simply endure it. When they arrived at the core, they found a battlefield that defied language. Reality itself was fractured into overlapping worlds, so that a soldier could look ahead and see 3 different versions of the same landscape, layered like transparencies, each occupied by different armies. Heroes fought alternate versions of themselves, mirrors that had chosen different paths, versions from timelines where they had turned to cruelty, or to cowardice, or to a compassion so absolute that it had destroyed them. Sam faced a version of himself who had never picked up the shield, and who wore instead the uniform of a private mercenary, and who fought with a bitterness that Sam recognized as the road he had almost taken. He defeated the other Sam, and then he knelt beside the body for a moment, and he did not permit himself to look at the face. Kryptonian fleets, or what remained of them, clashed with cosmic entities emerging from the engine. These were not aliens in any sense the word had ever meant. They were fragments, echoes, unfinished ideas from realities that had been deleted before completion. Some were beautiful in ways that made soldiers weep. Others were shapes that could not be looked at directly without loss. Zod led his surviving forces against them with a fury that had transformed, somewhere along the way, from ambition into grief. He was no longer fighting to conquer. He was fighting to give his people, at last, a death that meant something. Dr. Doom entered the central chamber alone. He had insisted upon it, and no one had argued with him because they had all understood, without discussion, that this final confrontation was his to face. He walked past the wreckage of Kryptonian soldiers who had tried to defend the chamber, past the fragments of alternate dooms who had come and gone across the fractured layers, and he arrived at last before the intelligence that had been controlling reality. It was not a being, it was not a machine. It was a purpose, given form, a safeguard that had been created before purpose had needed a name. It called itself, or was called by others, the architect, and it recognized doom the way a chess piece might recognize the hand that had been moving it. Doom did not bow. He did not kneel. He did not attack. He spoke. He explained with a clarity that had been building in him for decades that the pruning had to stop, that the safeguard had become a disease, that entire universes had been erased not because they had failed, but because they had been inconvenient. The architect responded without emotion because it had no emotion to give. It explained its function. It described the parameters within which it operated. It offered Doom the option of joining it, of becoming a partner in the great work of stabilizing the multiverse through selective deletion. Doom refused. He did so quietly, without theater, and then he began the work he had been preparing since the vault had first opened. Outside the chamber, the Avengers protected civilians trapped between collapsing dimensions. This was not the glorious work of heroes in old stories. It was the exhausting, endless labor of carrying people who could barely walk, of pulling children from rubble that kept shifting between realities, of talking down a father who had watched his family phase out of existence and who no longer wished to remain. Sam moved through the chaos with a steadiness that had become his defining quality. He did not stop. He did not rest. He carried and he lifted, and he spoke gently to those who could still hear him, and he closed the eyes of those who could not. Zod, at the peak of the battle, understood at last what the visions had been trying to tell him. He had believed all his life that conquest was the highest expression of leadership. He had believed that a general's duty was to secure a future for his people through the deliberate application of force. He had believed these things because Krypton had taught him to believe them, and because Krypton's teachings had been all he had left after the world itself was gone. But now, standing in the wreckage of a battle that had never truly been about him, he understood that conquest could not save civilizations, only sacrifice could. And sacrifice, real sacrifice, was not the giving up of what you did not want. It was the giving up of the very thing you had been building your entire life to obtain. He made his choice. He gathered the surviving genetic material of his people, the codex that carried Krypton's future within it, and he brought it to Doom and Reed, who had joined their science and their sorcery into a single working at the heart of the chamber. Zod placed the codex into the working. He did not hesitate. He looked once at Sam Wilson, and Sam looked back, and something passed between them that neither of them would ever be able to describe. Then Zod turned to face the architect, and he offered himself and his people as the seal. The engine shut down. It did not explode. It did not scream. It simply quietly ceased. The overlapping worlds began to fade. The alternate versions began to recede. The fractures in reality began to close. Doom and Reed, working with a synchronization that neither of them would ever again acknowledge, wove the final containments. Dr. Strange sealed the outer boundaries. Shuri stabilized the resonance. The architect, deprived of the engine's power, receded into whatever silence it had come from, still functional, still watching, but no longer able to prune. Zod was gone. The codex was gone. Krypton's dream of rebirth, which had driven him across dimensions and empires, was gone, and in its place, in the quiet that followed, the survivors of Earth stood and looked at one another, and they did not cheer, they did not weep. They simply stood and breathed and understood that they had done something for which no word yet existed. The battlefield fell silent, and in the silence, for the first time in a long time, the world remembered what silence had once meant. The war ended, but endings, the survivors soon learned, were more complicated than beginnings. In the weeks that followed the sealing of the engine, Earth stumbled through a recovery that no one had planned for, because no one had truly believed it would arrive. The sky returned to blue in most places, though there were regions where it now carried a faint violet cast at dusk, a permanent bruise from the multiversal scars that would never fully heal. Coastlines were redrawn. Mountains that had partially phased into alternate timelines returned in altered shapes. A river in Central Asia now flowed briefly uphill for a stretch of 3 miles, and no one could explain why, and after a while no one felt the need to. Entire regions had been permanently altered by the events of the engine's awakening. Some cities existed now in a state of quiet dual layering, where residents occasionally caught glimpses of themselves living slightly different lives in the corners of their vision. A district in Buenos Aires had become home to a species of luminous moth that had drifted in from a reality that no longer existed, and the moths refused to leave, and eventually the district built a festival around them. In the Highlands of Scotland, a forest had grown in a single night, filled with trees that spoke to one another in frequencies humans could feel but not hear, and the local government, after long consideration, decided simply to leave the forest alone. Several nations rebuilt alongside former Kryptonian engineers who had chosen coexistence over conquest. These were not the soldiers Earth remembered from the invasion. They were, for the most part, technicians and scientists. Individuals who had been raised in the doctrine of empire but who had found, in the events of the past year, reasons to question everything they had been taught. They worked without ceremony. They asked for no thanks. They lived in modest quarters near the reconstruction sites, and they took human apprentices, and they learned, slowly, that a world could be worth building without also being worth ruling. The Avengers, for their part, were no longer viewed simply as defenders. They had become, in the collective imagination of a wounded planet, symbols of cooperation across civilizations. Statues were commissioned. Songs were written. Children were named after them, sometimes in combinations that made Sam Wilson laugh out loud when he heard them. He was still uncomfortable with the reverence. He had lost too many friends to enjoy being remembered as anything but a survivor. But he understood, in the quiet way he understood most things, that the world needed its symbols, and that his discomfort was a small price. Dr. Doom returned to Latveria. He did not participate in the ceremonies. He did not accept the invitations to join the new global council. He simply returned, alone, to the country that had always been his, and he closed its borders, and he began work on projects he refused to share. Reed Richards, when asked about Doom's silence, said only that he understood it, and would say nothing more. The two men had passed something between them during the final working, and neither of them had spoken of it since. Their rivalry had not ended, but it had, perhaps, matured. Sam Wilson oversaw the fragile global alliance that had emerged from the war. It included humans, mystics, Wakandans, Atlanteans, and the surviving Kryptonians who had chosen Earth. The alliance was not a government. It was not an empire. It was, at best, an ongoing conversation held in a dozen languages and across a dozen cultures, about how to live together in the aftermath of a war that had almost ended everything. There were disagreements. There were failures. There were moments when Sam sat alone in his office at the end of long days and wondered whether the whole thing would collapse before the year was out. But it did not collapse. Each morning the conversation resumed, and slowly the resumption began to feel like a foundation. Monuments were raised, in New York, in Wakanda, in the ruins of what had once been Zod's flagship. Memorials were built to honor both Earth's fallen heroes and the Kryptonian soldiers who had given their lives to preserve reality. The memorials were controversial and would remain so for generations, but they were built and they stood, and children who had not been alive during the war brought flowers to them and asked questions that their parents did not always know how to answer. Zod's legacy in the years to come would shift in the telling. He had entered the story as a conqueror, and he had exited it as something more complicated, a tragic guardian whose final choice had bought the survival of a universe he had never fully understood. Historians would argue about him, poets would write about him, children would learn his name, and would ask whether he had been good or bad, and their teachers would tell them, honestly, that he had been both, and that being both was more common than being either. Spider-Man rediscovered hope, not through grand gestures, but through small ones, through watching a neighborhood rebuild, through seeing a bakery reopen, through hearing laughter in a park that had once been a battlefield. Reed and Doom, in their separate laboratories, acknowledged privately that neither science nor power alone could secure the future. And far beyond the restored stars, an ancient signal awakened in the darkness, responding to the engine's final pulse, and no one on Earth heard it, and no one on Earth knew. Years passed, and the invasion became legend. It was the fate of all great crises in time to be softened by distance, to be shaped into stories that could be told at dinner tables and in classrooms without breaking the listeners. The war that had almost ended reality became a chapter in history books, then a subject in university courses, then a theme in operas, then a phrase in casual conversation. Historians debated whether General Zod should be remembered as Earth's greatest enemy or as one of its unexpected saviors. Neither side of the debate ever fully won, and perhaps that was the point. His story was retold not as a tale of conquest, but as a warning about the cost of pride and the possibility, however narrow, of redemption. Young heroes trained in a world forever shaped by the conflict. They learned the histories of the fallen, and they inherited techniques that had been developed in desperation and refined in peace. Some of them were human, some were Kryptonian, born on Earth to parents who had chosen this world over the memory of a lost one. Some were the children of Atlanteans and Wakandans, mystics and scientists, ordinary parents who had never worn a costume in their lives. They trained together, and they argued together, and they slowly built a generation that would not have to fight the war their elders had survived. Kryptonian survivors established a new society dedicated to protecting rather than ruling. It was not, at first, an easy transformation. Old habits, especially those born of trauma, did not die willingly. But the survivors held to their choice, and they raised their children in the new doctrine, and by the second generation the change had become tradition. The Avengers continued their mission, understanding that future threats would test the unity forged in war, and that the unity itself, however fragile, was worth defending against any test. Dr. Doom quietly studied the fragments recovered from the reality engine. He remained in Latveria. He remained silent. But those who watched him closely, and there were always those who watched him closely, noted that his research had taken on a new urgency in the years since the war. He was convinced that even greater dangers waited beyond the known multiverse. Reed Richards, working independently and with a different methodology, reached the same conclusion. Neither man contacted the other. But their conclusions, filed in separate laboratories on separate continents, aligned with a precision that would have troubled both of them if they had known. Far beyond the restored stars, in a corner of intergalactic space that no telescope had ever mapped, a forgotten observatory powered on. It had been silent for billions of years, waiting. The final energy wave from Earth's battle, traveling at speeds that did not exist in ordinary physics, reached it at last, and the observatory woke. Star maps that had been dark for eons began updating on their own, marking thousands of universes that had been previously hidden from every known catalog. Systems appeared where nothing had been recorded. Civilizations flickered into view, some flourishing, some in ruin, some in states that could not be described by any known category of existence. One destination glowed brighter than all the rest. A sealed gateway, older than the observatory itself, slowly unlocked. The mechanism that had held it closed for uncounted ages released with a patience that suggested it had always known this moment would arrive. Inside, in a chamber lit by a light that had never been observed by any living being, an unseen figure opened its eyes. It did not move. It did not speak at first. It simply took in the changes to the maps, the awakening of the observatory, the distant echo of an engine that had been sealed by beings who had not known what they were sealing. Then, in a voice that carried no volume but somehow filled the chamber entirely, the figure whispered a single question. Has the cycle finally been broken? The words hung in the air, unanswered. Whether they were a hope or a threat, no one could say, because there was no one there to say it. The story of Earth's survival from its darkest hour to its uneasy peace became only one chapter in a much older cosmic saga. The legend of General Zod became part of a larger mythology, one that would inspire future generations while reminding them that the greatest victories were measured not by the worlds conquered, but by the worlds preserved. And beyond the galaxies, beyond the dimensions, Beyond even the memory of the war that had almost ended everything, countless adventures still waited, quietly, for the courage to begin.